It was published last Monday. So we've already spoken about three of its main takeaways during over the past three workshops. So today we're looking at the local governance questions and those local involved communities that are involved in climate questions. And we're asking the question, is localization actually bearing fruit? So we've got an expert panel today. They've all participated in at the COP and also in the report and also in drafting certain projects which have emphasized local initiatives which are really allowing us to move forward in energy transition concerning forest management, building renovation also. So we'll talk about this moving forward. So this session is recorded and there is interpretation between French and English. So please just, if you need to listen to one or the other interpretations, choose the language that you wish, which will be at the bottom of the screen. So I am Antoine Gillod. I'm the coordinator of the Climate Change Observatory. And I will give the floor to Tania, who is one of the co-authors of this report, who will talk to us about the main takeaways of this report.
Merci Antoine. Je vais passer à l'anglais pour présenter le rapport et un peu l'association aussi. So I'm going to be speaking in English now, and I hope all of you can see my screen. Okay. So we're here in the context of the publication of the 2021 edition of the Climate Change Observatory's Global Synthesis Report on Climate Action by Sector. I'm going to present the association a little bit for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, and then also the observatory, and then the report itself. And then I'll present some of the main findings of the report, which are pertinent to the discussion that we're going to be having today. And then finally, we're going to take about an hour or so to discuss with the various speakers that we have today on the question, is the localization of climate action paying off? So about Climate Chance, Climate Chance is a platform of non-state actors from around the world that was created in 2015 ahead of the COP21 with the idea of bringing together non-state actors in all their diversity to work on issues of local climate action. So we have a website, which is our portal of action, which is available in French and English, which focuses on projects on the field, on sharing best practices that are implemented around the world, but also especially on the African continent. And this basically provides a space for exchange between various actors. And at the beginning, we started with this role that affirms the importance of non-state actors and focusing on advocacy. And then we realized the importance of explaining the action that has been concretely carried out. And it's in this context that we have the Observatory, which for 3 years now has been publishing reviews of climate action, be it a sector-based analysis or of focus on local action or even climate finance or adaptation. And we also do periodical case studies from countries and regions around the world. And finally, we also organize key events which gather actors from the climate community around the world in order to create synergies and build projects together. These are our supporters without whom these projects would not be possible. So I'd like to take a moment to thank them. So coming to the report itself that we're discussing, while all eyes are usually on promises and commitments that are made, we at the Climate Change Observatory prefer to take a step back from these and analyze climate action in terms of concrete actions and steps that have already been taken. So our aim is to tell the story of climate action by looking at the figures behind greenhouse gas emissions, drawing on scientific and specialized reports, but building this in the form of a narrative that provides an insight into how businesses, local and regional governments have all acted over the last year or so, every year to reduce their emissions and to adapt to climate change. And so this particular report looks at the 6 main emission sectors of energy, transport, buildings, industry, waste, and land use. And most importantly, we look at the world as it is and not as we would like it to be. So this year for the report, we've come up with a new format that has 4 basic rubrics across each of the sectors. And the entire report, which you can find online on the links that have been shared by my colleagues, the entire report is a very interactive document. You can click on it and it leads you to the right pages. You can switch between it really easily. So the first rubric that we have is indicators, which compiles objective data on the emissions and how they've evolved and the major actions that have been taken in each sector. And then we have 19 trends. So the trends are the core part of the analysis that we carry out in each sector. And each trend looks at a subsector. The one in the slide, for example, looks at road transport. So the trends are divided into 2 parts. First being data overview, which provides a sort of macro perspective of the data and actions that have been carried out in the subsector. And then the second part, the observatory's lens, is more of a hand-picked selection of topics that have been authored by us at the Climate Chance team, or even with contributions from experts like Marie-Ange, who is with us today. Then we also have signals, which are basically a press review that is compiled from the observatory's year-round monitoring of initiatives, regulation changes, or changes in the market that today signal what the trends of tomorrow will be. And finally, we have case studies, which are written in partnership with organizations, as you can see on the screen, some of whom are joining us today. And these help us understand the drivers of success based on public policies or policies of enterprises at various levels and from countries and regions around the world. And so the summary of the report was published at COP26, and we had a press conference, we had a side event where we helped understand the 10 key takeaways from the report. And effectively, the complexity of everything that we find out through the report could probably be summed up with the title, Back to the Future 2021, The Great Acceleration in Climate Action and Emissions. So what we see is that the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed 2 broader, seemingly contradictory trends, where on one hand, you see climate action that is accelerating in terms of the installation of renewables or the adoption of electric mobility, commitments to carbon neutrality, or disruptive technologies and so on. But at the same time, you also see a rise in emissions driven by the economic recovery that we see taking place in various countries. So the sector-based report, which we're presenting today, is the only document that summarizes climate action year after year to look how these 2 trends coexist and how complex climate action actually is. So today's debate is going to focus on the role of local governments as actors. And this is in fact taken from the 9th key takeaway, which I presented earlier. And cities play a key role as drivers of action because they're centers of activity which have the largest concentrations of population and of emissions. And for example, if we look at Europe, cities that are signatory to the Covenant of Mayors decreased their emissions by 25% from 2005 to 2017. And this is ahead of the EU's own goal of reduction by 2020. So we see that often the main areas of action where local governments take the lead are the actions where they have the most autonomy to chalk out their own policies. And these include renewable energy supply, the transformation of urban mobility, waste management, or buildings, the construction of buildings, or even heating and space cooling. So in the energy sector, we see an increasing municipalization of energy sourcing. So the pandemic had induced a drop in global energy demand, which was mostly absorbed by coal and fossils, and renewables emerged the star players. And in this context, we see that cities have been extremely dynamic in setting targets for renewable energy. So the data that you see on the right side of the screen, which was compiled by REN21, shows that 834 cities as of 2020 had adopted objectives in terms of renewables in at least one sector of activity. And 617 cities had set objectives of 100% renewables for their energy procurement. And this means that around 1 billion inhabitants around the world live in cities that have already set targets in terms of renewables. So then we ask ourselves, what are the tools or the levers that cities and local governments are using to diversify their energy procurement and to shift towards renewables? And we see that PPAs, or power purchase agreements, are some of the most popular tools. In the US, for example, 3,306 megawatts have been contractualized through PPAs, which are basically bilateral agreements between the consumers of electricity and the producers. And in the US, we often see community choice aggregations, which is when several actors who might individually be too small to contractualize a PPA gather together to purchase their energy. We also see larger cities like Melbourne and London that have been making use of PPAs for their energy supply. So to focus a little more on the case of Melbourne, which saw an astounding 14% drop in its emissions, which it accounts to the use of renewables in its infrastructural power consumption. So how Melbourne carried this out was through the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, the MREP. The first one launched in 2019, and the first one launched in 2019. And so Melbourne became the first Australian council to cover 100% of its infrastructural power consumption with renewables, notably wind from the Crowlands Wind Farm, which is in Victoria. And then in 2020, you have the second plan, which was signed for a larger amount, equaling around 22,000 households. The first plan accounted for the power consumption of the equivalent of 17,600 households, and the second one for 22,000 households. And so you see how this sets an example for other cities as well. And we see this trend that is gaining in popularity. So coming to the buildings sector, we see that the building sector amounts for around 37% of global energy-related emissions. This was found out by the Global Alliance on Buildings and Construction. And a deeper breakdown of this reveals that around 1/4 of the emissions from the building sector are from constructions, and the remaining 3/4 are from the use phase of buildings, be it from heating or from the electricity that is used in buildings for various appliances or for space cooling. We also see that within this context, local governments have implemented the most actions or policies to decarbonize buildings. We see 2,400 actions which were reported across 336 cities. And among these actions, we see most notably the growing popularity of the electrification of heating and of heat pumps and of district heating and cooling. And this is something that we'll be talking about a little bit more in detail later today. So this is one such example of district heating and cooling, which basically makes use of closed energy loops so that you have places which are relatively warmer from where heat is transferred to places which are relatively cooler, and thus reducing wastage. So I'm not going to spend too much time focusing on this case study, but I invite you to discover it in the report. And here we have another interesting example when it comes to electric heating in the United States, which presents a very interesting picture. So natural gas, driven by very favorable market conditions, was popularized in the early 2010s as a bridge fuel in the United States to facilitate the energy transition from coal towards renewables. However, gas itself, being a fossil, is quite emitted. So we find out that in 2019, there's a movement that starts with cities that want to ban the use of gas in new residential or non-residential buildings. They started with the Berkeley City Council, and then we have other Californian cities that followed suit, and this movement just gaining momentum. And then as a reaction to this in 2020, we see that the gas industry begins to react by calling these bans extreme. And then you have the gas lobby finding support in conservative states who restrictions on the use of gas or banning the bans. And this shows how subnational governments, which here are the states, could also impede climate action if they so find it to be in the interest of their communities. And then the next sector that I'd like to talk about is transport or mobility, more specifically. And we see that the pandemic has left a very clear mark on mobility, how we perceive it. And if you've joined us for the previous debates, we spoke about how urban planning and mobility systems need to go hand in hand. And we see a shift in paradigm which is emerging. So through the pandemic, we noticed drops in public transport usage, very marked drops in terms of percentages. We even have public transport companies that went bankrupt due to the lack of fares coming in from passengers, as was the case in certain cities in Brazil. And public transport usage has still not returned to the pre-crisis levels. But at the same time, we also see an increased demand for newer equipment in public transport, such as electric buses, which is what you could find in the case study on Bogota, if you look at the report. At the same time, we see an increase in the popularity of electric vehicles. And hand in hand with this, we see an increasing number of cities that have restricted the circulation of internal combustion engine vehicles in certain areas or certain zones within the city. And lastly, we also see that cycling and walking in forms of soft mobility have been emerging on top because of the pandemic. We have over 1,800 cities that have set up temporary or permanent measures in order to encourage cycling and walking. And so we focus a little bit on cycling. There's been an extensive rollout of cycling infrastructure around the world and the promotion of non-motorized transport. In fact, the European Cyclist Federation lists that close to 1,500 kilometers of cycling tracks or cycle lanes have already been laid out, mostly in Europe. And we also have these being divided as either exclusively bike lanes or lanes with reduced mobility or restrictions on cars. And you have increasing popularity of bicycle mayors, which is the case in cities like Nairobi, which also allocated 20% of its infrastructure budget to non-motorized transportation. And other cities in Africa as well, such as Gaborone, Cape Town, Kampala. There's also Addis Ababa, which adopted a strategy to promote non-motorized transportation. I do apologize for the noise. We seem to have some construction happening in the neighboring office. So another thing that has benefited greatly from the pandemic has been micro-mobility, including scooters, bike shares, and so on. And Bike Sharing Blog, which is a website, you can find the source in the report, has listed 1,882 bike sharing systems across the world that exist, mainly in Europe, East Asia, and North America. And in fact, so much so has been the popularity or the increase in popularity of bicycles that added to the lockdown-induced production and supply problems has created a worldwide shortage in spare parts for bicycles. So I would finally like to talk about the waste sector, where not only waste management is a key priority, but recycling as well, seeing the shortages that we see around the world in crucial raw materials. Recycling becomes important, it becomes a priority. And we see that local actors often best placed to act because waste management and collection are often things that find themselves in regional jurisdiction. So 3 examples here. The first one is Quebec, which has an electricity mix that is suited for the electrification of end uses, and particularly transport, which is one of the province's largest emitting sectors. And so Quebec has set an important target in terms of electronic vehicles. And when we talk about electronic vehicles, we have to talk about batteries. And so the provincial government recognizes the importance of ensuring a supply of strategic and critical metals, and as part of its strategy has set up research and funding for recycling batteries. They even launched a pilot project in Anjou in Montreal, which is capable of recycling 200 tons of batteries per year. Another example from Canada is the province of British Columbia, which has a comprehensive operational extended producer responsibility, or EPR system, where producers are held responsible for a part of the waste that they produce. And so the funds that are collected from them are used directly to manage the collection, transport, sorting, and treatment of waste. So British Columbia has around 17 EPR programs across various sectors like paint or printed paper and packaging. And finally, from the case study of Mendoza in Argentina, we also see how social goals can be included in this, because Mendoza has an integrated urban solid waste management plan, which aims to achieve 100% solid waste management in the metropolitan area of the city and in the Uco Valley, with 2 goals. The first being environmental protection, and the second being the social inclusion of informal waste workers in the sector. And this is a problem that is common to quite a lot of cities in the developing world. And we also have some takeaways from the land use sector, but I will leave that to Marie-Ange to present. And with that, I would like to wind up this presentation and hand the floor back to Antoine.
Merci, Tania. I switch back to French. So, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We know that all of this is very pressing, and the global recovery is really giving us a lot of constraints. So I'd like to thank our presenters for being here today. Firstly, Mohammed Nbou. He's the chair of climate diversity at the United Local Government Council in Africa. Thank you for having joined us last minute. I would also like to welcome Marie-Ange Kalenga, who works at Fern. Jean-Benoît, c'est un project manager senior ACR+, and he's working on waste management. Rutger, who is a research assistant at Building Performance Institute Europe. And then Sébastien Delpont is the deputy chair of Greenflex, which is a consulting firm. Firstly, Mohammed, what is your takeaway of COP26? It just wrapped up a couple of weeks ago. Usually after, or so we go to these large international events quite often. We've been going to them for the past 10 years. So the MGA is represented there. COP really brings together all of these states, and does it represent local governments? That's something that we have to think about. Of course, Damien will speak about this. So what is your feeling as to the results of the COP26? All of the actors, both state and non-state actors, are very important. But I think we have to put all of this into context. we see that there is two things that we have to keep in mind in this time right now. Is firstly the economic recovery and also the COVID pandemic. We also have to think about the GIAC report. It is very difficult for the interpreter to hear what he's saying. His speech is extremely muffled.
Pardon, excusez-moi, est-ce qu'on peut demander à Monsieur Nbou de parler un peu plus près du micro?
Mr. Nbou has to speak closer to the microphone because it's impossible to hear him.
Merci.
That's better. It's very important when that we have to keep in mind what's happening in the United States and that they were there. It was a very special and interesting context, which happened at the COP26. For the results, I think what they were looking for was so ambitious that maybe at the end of the day, we didn't really achieve the goals that everyone was trying to achieve. There were two main pillars in the Paris Agreement. And I think that when we look at mitigation concepts, I think that we can see that most of the parties that we can say and that can accept that we're very far away from the goal of 1.5 degrees. There were some things that were quite interesting in moving forward after Glasgow, especially considering the progressive reduction of coal-fired energy production. And it was the first time that it was explicitly mentioned in the report. Also, it was mentioned that subsidies were mentioned, and also the subsidies of fossil fuel energy production. However, there's something that's very interesting concerning the local authorities. We have to really rely upon these nature-based solutions. And we know that the local authorities are the ones that are working on the ground about these nature-based solutions. And I think that that's why it was important that these local authorities were included in the COPE process. It was explicitly said in the final agreement that these nature-based solutions based on the local authorities were included. And I think this is extremely crucial for me. I think there is about 34 countries and other organisms who promised to put a gradual end to the use of fossil fuels in energy production. Why is that? Because we were very, very clear at the national level so that we're very sure when we speak about localization or local positive acts.
Merci, s'il vous plaît, de fermer vos micros lorsque vous n'intervenez pas.
Please turn off your microphones if you're not taking the floor. I think it was really important because, as I said, that when I mentioned about the organisms, these were financial organisms that were included in these pledges, and that they pledged to stop supporting financially the fossil fuel production and the companies that are related to it. We hope that this will start to take place from next year on, so 2022 on. So if we look at the actual pledges, you have to go into the crux of the matter to see if it's possible to achieve the objective of 1.5. So, but all of this has to be undertaken, in my opinion, at the local authority level. These local authorities play a major role. They have a crucial space that they have to take on, so that we can achieve this objective of 1.5 degrees. As you said, Antoine, that it was really important to have this lobbying within the LMG group, so that all of the so that they could be included in within the group, and that they could be included in the final statement, and that they play that they are a motor in this that the localization of these climate positive acts is very important, and that they play an important role. So maybe we'll come back to the local authorities and the various regional actors. But let's look at concrete examples. You spoke about nature-based solutions. So therefore, I would like to give the floor to Marie-Ange Kalenga from Fern. Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Yeah. Yes. I'd like to, could you please wrap up in 1 minute? So adaptation is a crucial element. And this is also linked hand in hand with the localization of these positive climate acts. And we have financed these adaptation methods, when our financing has been increased to more than $350 million. And for the first time, we will see that there will be in a report options and results concerning the adaptation. I have a lot of things that I had to say, but no, we'll come back to that at the end of the presentation, especially concerning COP27. You've spoke about adaptation. It's a very good, because it's really the link up between the various paths that we're going to speak about. And Madame Marion will talk about forest management, local communities involvement in this management. Of course, they're a carbon well, but they also work in mitigate. They're also, our forests are involved in mitigation of climate change. It's a very important element for the social and economic life of various populations, not only where you are, Marie-Ange, but also everywhere in the world. And they have a very large impact on adaptation concerning climate change. So could you speak about this a little bit to see how these citizen organizations concerning forest management, how they're really moving forward? Europe questioned the flags, the forest law enforcement, governance and trade, and also the voluntary partnership agreement. These were put together to really manage forest and to limit deforestation in Europe. It's had a very large impact in avoiding deforestation. Maybe you could speak about this tool or these tools. In this, you spoke about the advantages of this. So could you speak about this a little bit, especially in the Central African context?
Deux petits mots sur notre organisation. Nous sommes une ONG environnementale basée à Bruxelles, au cœur des institutions européennes, et nous œuvrons depuis plus d'une vingtaine d'années pour que les politiques.
For the last 20 years, we've been working to make sure that policies in the EU would have a positive impact, not just for forest management, but for the populations. We are working with civil society organizations in West and Central Africa, also in Latin America, in Southeast Asia. Your question is very relevant in a context of regulations at a European level, but at the global level to fight against deforestation. Last month, November 17, the EU Commission put on the table the proposals to fight against deforestation and to take its responsibility in the consumption of farm products, agricultural products, which lead to forest deterioration and deforestation. As far
Excusez-moi, merci.
we have an echo, we have an echo.
Des interruptions intempestives. Merci beaucoup.
Alors, il était question dans le cadre de l'élaboration.
As far as the elaboration of this document, we were going to put an end to some partnerships, which would have been an heresy. These agreements are supposed to fight against legal deforestation for over-exploitation of wood and timber. These agreements contain a social aspect that is very important. They allow us to define the best practices and to have new regulations for the implementation of tools like participative and community participation. We've seen it in Cameroon or Republic of Central Africa or Congo, have included in their forest code these tools and have used this as a lever to strengthen their commitments and also to help to lead the civil society and private sector to bring them around the table to discuss the relevant measures and to ask for the forest sector contribution to economy and to living conditions, local living conditions. What we could say about community management of forests in Central Africa, it's lagging a bit behind compared to Southeast Asia or Latin America for several reasons. Very few lands are given to communities directly. They are not legally owning. We're talking about 1% in Central Africa compared to 10%. Of course, that's a hindrance to community forestry. The legal framework, even though has evolved in a positive way, is still, unfortunately, not always very clear and not in favor so much of communities which have to navigate with management tools which they do not necessarily master very well and do not necessarily have the capacities or the finances to actually support. And one could say also that this community forestry also is facing other stakes, challenges in Central Africa, where most countries want to emerge and want to have diversification policies, which may increase pressure on forests in terms of agriculture. Some are dreaming of a country like Indonesia, which built its economy on exportation of palm oil, trees, and other models like the extractions of minerals, as in Congo, the Republic of Congo, or oil. All these other priorities do not go in the direction of forest protection or involving the communities as full-time stakeholders for sustainability of these land and for climate change. We talked about nation-based solutions, strengthening the rights of the communities by giving them a better access to such tools like forestry ownership or would really go in the direction of inclusiveness and help to tackle the issues of vulnerability, such as inequalities, gender inequalities. Research institutes are specialized, or NGO, international right and resources initiative, for example, that showed that reinforcing the rights of communities is a tool that is very important for forest protection and for fighting against climate change, by showing that the rate of deforestation in areas where the communities are managing the forests, or in the Amazon region, the rates were much lower. The rates of deforestation were much lower than other regions which are not under the control of the communities. These researches also highlighted that the forests where communities live are managed by them. They absorbed a lot more carbon. They are much better quality. These forests are in much better health. What we can say regarding the situation in Central Africa, maybe, is to look at what happened in other regions, in other geographies, to try to draw the best solutions possible, and to remember that communities which depend on forests in the region represent a lot of the populations that for generations they've known how to preserve forests. They know forests better than anyone else and are the best ambassadors. We cannot talk about forest protection without involving the communities, such as partnership agreements and other tools. We talked about the EU as part of these new regulations. The EU will try to adopt or implement other tools to reinforce the CDNs, the NDCs. They will implement partnerships for forests. Other tools that could be helpful as a lever for larger deployment and quicker deployment. Also the NDCs as part of the Paris Agreement. Some have included community forestation as a tool, and we hope that beyond 2022, for Central Africa, others will seize this opportunity to include and involve all the communities. We will come back to this indeed. You mentioned the NDCs. We will talk about international cooperation and how the networking can help both national policies and help local communities when they get in charge of the forest management to actually get inspired by best practices. We see here some important governance challenges. We will come back to this in a minute. Now, the issue of forests echoes, and that's a whole challenge of mitigation to climate change. Wherever a consumer is, what does he consume in terms of raw materials to satisfy his own needs and for the consumption goods that they need? A low carbon world would be a world with a lot of energy, a lot of resources, and access to resources, circular economies, an entry point for a more virtuous model. The UNEP believes that a sustainable world would be a use of 7 tons per inhabitant rather than 12 at the moment, 12 tons. Some areas have up to 27 tons per inhabitant, which needs to be reduced by 12. There is a correlation between the needs and the consumption of materials, which means we need to develop recycling solutions, circular economy solutions. The last report on waste management was the World Bank 2018. which shows the link between circular economy and gas emission reduction is still feeble. Jean-Benoît, you are working for ACR+, also looking at the waste management issue and more circular deployment systems. How did you perceive the year that has just gone by in terms of circular economy and waste management? We know that COVID had an important impact on waste production. Did you see any breakthroughs at ACR+, your company? Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for giving me the floor. Well done for your report. This is very interesting. You did a huge work to show the role of local actors. I think that's fundamental. Yes, we are a network of cities at a European level. We want to facilitate the sharing of best practices and helping our members to progress in circular economy. We are seeing quite a few progress in terms of circular economy. What we have noted over the last year, we were assimilating circular economy to waste management, and we realized it wasn't that important. But recently, since for the last few years, we have more and more proof to show, evidence to show that the management of resources has an important carbon print, almost like energy. And with this in mind, we wanted at ACR+ to launch a campaign, more circularity, less carbon, and help to show the link between circular economy and local strategy of carbon, which often are very much turned towards energy and not so much towards circular economy. The purpose was to equip this. There is a trend also to look at quantities, especially quantity or volume of waste. The main purposes, goal that we have are recycling goals at a local level to increase the percentage of recycling. And this has decreased. We often have this quantitative approach without any real link on the environment. So this was the purpose of our campaign. We want to help our members to come out of their local carbon print and to look at also the exported and imported carbons. This is we have a Zero Waste Scotland, which is the Scottish Waste Management Office, and they are monitoring the carbon print in their waste. This tool is helpful, and it helps to implement at a local level, which are available. The waste data are more available at a local level. The purpose of this tool, however, is to look at the components of the waste. What do we do with it? Where is it going? Is it going to incineration, to recycling? And as we collect local data and also the waste management to evaluate the carbon print, not just of the treatment, we look at the impact, of course, on recycling and the incineration, but also we study the print in all the waste that are thrown away and the production of products that have become waste. We always have the idea of waste as a value. When you throw away a waste, you throw all the carbon print that was necessary to produce it beforehand. Now, the purpose behind our members, therefore, bring us data, and we go through this tool. We use it with the tool, and we try to look at what it means in terms of circular economy strategy for waste to reduce the carbon print by 20%. We have supported and accompanied 6 members since 2020, since we launched the survey, and the first outcomes that there are also territorial discrepancies or differences, but also similarities. With the members that we have monitored, waste management, when the waste is treated, usually it is either neutral or it helps avoid emissions, thanks to recycling mainly, which is quite positive. However, when we add the carbon print contained in the waste, what was necessary to make it, then we realize that the waste management has actually little impact and that the main challenge is to limit the production of the waste and to favor the conservation of the materials. We have a few exceptions, like wrapping glass, where this is a locked circle recycling, if you like. But for others, we realize that recycling has limits in terms of carbon emissions. Of course, we shouldn't stop recycling. There's a whole potential for improving recycling activity, developing further techniques. But we realize that we will not reach carbon neutrality with simply management of at the end of life of the waste. We need to also implement the reuse and of the waste. We don't really see a correlation between quantity and the carbon print or carbon impact. It's not necessarily the larger ones that have the larger impact. What we have found with high, strong impact plastics, that's mainly plastics, all the food waste is something that we know very well of with a huge potential, but part which is quite marginal in terms of quantity with a large impact are textiles. Textiles is a surprise that we get every time. Textiles can represent only a few percent in waste, but their carbon print can be 1/3 or 1/4, even more, of a carbon print at a local level. We try to analyze these various data in a comparative way to better understand the connection between local strategies, how context will change a carbon print, and to see how we can implement prevention action that would be more ambitious to reduce the carbon print. To give you an example, to reduce by 25% for local waste of all our members would mean reducing by 20% the amount of local waste. And that's only 25% reduction, so we're still far from the carbon neutrality. What we're seeing also is that local actors are able to implement actions on prevention or end of life, or the conception also of products. We were talking about textiles. We have textiles which are harder and harder to reuse because of the bad quality. We also have market logics which are shorter lifespan of products because of the fashion or the trends. So the purpose of our campaign was to see how to collaborate with other stakeholders to reach carbon neutrality. Thank you. We will have the opportunity to talk about this dynamic of partnership for all the topics which we'll have around this roundtable. This is a main point. The environment, we've already talked about it. I'm going to give you the floor now, Rutger. I'm going to ask my question in French, but I'm sure it's being translated. The Netherlands, regarding the building sector, have an objective or decarbonization of 1.5 million buildings by 2030, relying on local authorities, on heat transition vision strategies, based on the energy consumption of the building. Now, there was a scheme quite impressive of multi-level governance in order to set objectives for retrofit, energy retrofit. When we look at the difficulties that we have in France reaching that goal, it's quite impressive to see the scheme that you've put in place. You wrote a document in the report. Could you tell us a little bit more about the progress that have been made? What are the difficulties also to implement these goals?
Merci beaucoup, Antoine. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. I'll switch now to English. My name is Rutger, and I'll shortly dive into the Dutch planning for decarbonization of buildings. And to do that, I made a short presentation, which I will now share with you. I hope you can now see my screen. I see thumbs up, that's good. Okay, so I will talk about the district approach, as it's called in the Netherlands, and the role of Dutch local authorities in building decarbonization. So short word about us. So I work for BPIE. We are a European nonprofit think tank working in the building policy field. And we do lots of independent research into the energy performance of buildings. So why are buildings important? Of course, Antoine already introduced a bit of the urgency of that. So we know that in Europe, many buildings have been built before 1975, and 50% of those buildings will still be in use in the future. At the same time, we see that buildings are responsible for roughly 40% of total energy consumption and 36% of the CO2 emissions in Europe. This is why it's very important to renovate buildings in Europe, and that is what the Dutch government is planning to do. Moreover, people spend a lot of their time indoors, 90% in Europe, and a lot of electricity consumption comes out of buildings. Many people also cannot heat their buildings properly, and these are all issues that can be tackled while we also improve the energy performance. So I will talk about 5 things in my short presentation, starting with what are the strategies that the Dutch municipalities are implementing. How does this work, the transition vision heating strategies, and what is the role of cities and regional governments? What are tools used to implement and monitor these transition vision heatings? And what are challenges that cities are facing? So why are municipalities developing these decarbonization strategies? It's because of the climate agreement in which we committed to decarbonize 1.5 million buildings. This is many, many buildings on a building stock of 9 million. This is combined also with regional energy strategies where we try to figure out what are the available renewable heat sources, and also a program where we have pilot districts that we try to decarbonize that then can be the lessons which can then be used for other districts in the Netherlands. So what is a transition vision heating strategy? It's a strategy made by each municipality. In the Netherlands, we have 352 that they have to submit before the end of this year. And in this strategy, it basically contains a roadmap how to decarbonize the complete building stock of the city. And towards 2030, the cities must present a couple of districts which they will start with. And for those selected districts, they will have to develop a detailed implementation plan, which they have to write next year. And here below, you see the 5 steps that the municipalities in the Netherlands have to take to actually do that. So they explore first, they plan, they talk with different people around, they make a draft, and this must be approved by the local councils. So what are tools used to implement and monitor this? So first of all, we founded an expertise center heating, which is available for all the municipalities for questions on technical nature, on legal nature, on financial nature. Secondly, templates were developed. For example, how can you calculate end user costs after renovation? What is the business case for district heating? There are guidelines how to develop the strategy itself. And there's guidelines how to involve local stakeholders, be it companies, be it inhabitants, be it district distribution system operators. And lastly, there's a map which shows which of the municipalities in the Netherlands have already completed their transition fission heating. So in September 2021, status report was updated, and here you can see the results. So on the left side, you see in green and light green and yellow the ones that are the transition fission heating strategies that have been finished so far. You see in blue the ones that are currently writing it, and the ones in gray that have not participated in the survey. So you see that already, say 1/3 of the strategies has been finished and part of them has been adopted. And on the right side, you see for those that have been adopted, so the green ones, what the results are. So right now there's an ambition to decarbonize more than 450,000 residential buildings. And you see that the amount of other buildings, like hotel buildings, utility buildings, that it's a smaller amount. And you see that there is a share of the buildings that they want to insulate, but not completely disconnect from the gas grid. This shows that already lots of efforts are being done. But there are challenges. So when we were implementing these strategies, we see that there's high complexity from different nature, technical, legal, social. And we see that the scale of the projects and the participation of stakeholders is essential. Moreover, in these strategies, municipalities select certain districts to start with, but a lot of the districts, there's no solution yet. So this will have to be developed in the future. And there is a platform for which there's a link here where lessons learned about this process are being shared among the different municipalities. We also see that the municipalities cannot do this alone. So there need to be changes on a national level to facilitate this, amongst others in the law. The heating law and the Planning and Environment Act. For example, in one district where they decarbonized 90% of the buildings, for the 5% of the buildings that were not available, or the 10%, a specific gas pipeline needed to be reconstructed, which was very costly. So there need to be changes in the law to make sure that you can decarbonize complete districts. Moreover, there needs to be financial stimulus to make gas more expensive and electricity cheaper to stimulate electric heating, and more insulation and hybrid heat pumps are required. So key takeaways from this short presentation is that local authorities are key stakeholders in decarbonizing buildings. Local authorities are rooted, they are better connected to the local building owners and users. And a large amount of municipalities have already developed a strategy while others are still working on it. We see that when municipalities implement these plans, there's a slowdown in certain municipalities, for example, Purmerend, while other municipalities show that there's a scaling up of the efforts. And general lessons are strategic planning showed the complexity of the task at hand, which is essential to know for municipal policymakers. More funding is necessary, and judicial, technical, and social issues must be tackled. That was my short presentation. Back to you, Antoine.
Merci Rutger, et la transition est toute trouvée, c'est un hasard en fait un petit peu de notre agenda et de nos choix.
Thank you very much, and it's a very pertinent topic. You also did another, there was another case study in our report, a Helen case study, and we were looking at how cooling and heating, 5G cooling and heating network were being put in place, and there will be a presentation about this in a second. So I'd like to go now to Sébastien Delpont from Greenflex. Can you hear me? Yes. Welcome to this presentation. Greenflex is a consulting firm. You will talk about it quickly. You look at European projects, especially interregional cooperation, and a European project called D2 Grid, which looks at 5G heating and cooling systems. What are the advantages of these heating and cooling networks 5G, and how are these solutions adapted to the various specificities in the areas? Yes, we are a consulting firm, and we work hand in hand with the companies in energy transition, consulting, management of projects, and also assistance. We do city projects. So if we look at how we can look at different cities and accompany them, and There are questions about forests, food, construction materials, and two big topics, energy efficiency and sourcing various renewable products. We have to look at the potential of the actual area. How can we transform and put value on these transmissions so that we can make it more circular in the future? Because it's very important to have this energy circular economy to really include everything in the loop. So yes, we work on the D2 grid project. It's 14 partners, French, Scottish, German, Dutch. We're all working together. A lot of very interesting experiments, and it's really important to be interconnected. So it's one more part of the puzzle, and we also try to scale up also, and it will allow to cost reduction to put in place these solutions. We've been working on putting in place these 5G solutions. So how can we qualify them? How can we look at all of the energy needs, offices, factories, residential areas, cooling, or electricity? So we have to look at this together so that all of these are part of the ecosystem. We're going to have to choose one point at a time. Does it better adapt it to this? We really have to look after the needs and to look at exchange amongst the various partners. We're also looking at programming, which is also very necessary. There's a need also today concerning the future. Maybe we're looking at a rural area with for a development of there may be some type of methane that's being produced in these rural areas to produce biogas. It's all very important to look to the future. So today we have to see if we can insulate the buildings better. We have to look at this in a holistic way. Look at what's needed today, tomorrow. How can we be flexible, and what will be the various energy needs and their specificities? We look at heating networks and also low temperature heating networks, which will allow us to use more local renewable energy sources. We can see we use this with hot water circulation at 80 degrees. It's not steam. So this is the largest sourcing possible from solar, geothermal, solar. This will lead also, we're also trying to put together data centers. If we don't manage this properly, it will just turn into waste. So we have to look at the needs. And then we're going to look at these Canadian pumps or the heat pumps with a very high output compared with traditional uses. So we call these consumactors, if you like. We know there are some areas which will be hotter. They will share it then with other areas, and vice versa. We also work together with governance. We know that this is a give and take question, and this happens all throughout the year. We have to know who they are, when it is. Is giving hot water in the middle of summer, is it the same? Does it have the same value as, for example, giving it on the 15th of December? We know that solar energy may overproduce, so this has to be then we have to look at how we can use this profitably. For example, people produce these solar produces energy during the day. People aren't using it during the day, so we have to work together with the local and national networks. Maybe charging a car, EVs, for example. How can we use it? How can we stock it the best way? For example, it can be stocked as hot water, so that way we have silos that stop the hot water. It has to be done in a very low-tech and robust manner. We have to do this together with various differing urban contexts. There are various actors in France. We have a lot of needs in France here. We have super calculators that are called, that are linked up with the data center that can give us various interesting results. Some mines are being used. We use previous coal mines, and we're going to try to use them as geothermal pumps. So it's very interesting. We have to look at the geography, the governments, and also the various adequation within the area itself. So there are, for example, less densely populated areas. And we know that in these areas, maybe a solar with geothermal could be a good solution. We're going to look at the complementarity of the various uses over the area. Or is it older buildings, newer buildings? It's a topic that's very interesting that can be developed. So this D2 grid is looking at 5 demonstrations in Europe: Glasgow, Nottingham, Sackley, Erle in the Netherlands, with the precursor developments, and also in Bochum. We need to have a common benchmark. It's not only a piece, an artwork, but it's actually a working system that has to be put in place. Areas have to be optimized. Governance, case business models, financing, robust nature. Who are all of the various stakeholders? These are very key elements. We're also trying to involve the local civil society stakeholders. This is how we put all of this in place. We also have a site that allows you to calculate in a very simple way to take into account various elements such as the population size, etc., and to see if it's really worth putting in place such a system. We want to make sure that the heating is very accessible. We have to try to target competitive energy sources. For example, in the north of France, it's not going to be as competitive with the south of France. So we have to look at this in a worldwide geographical manner. This is one of the projects that we are an actor in.
Les autres questions que je voulais poser à chacun d'entre vous qui en fait tournaient.
So I'm going to try to sum up the questions that I'd like to ask each party. Adequate economic models have to be taken into account. Would you like to come back and talk to us about the European projects and how you're working on these European projects? Does this allow you to really exchange best practices and really roll out these projects on a large scale? We know that if you go maybe alone, you're going to if you do it alone, you're going to go quicker, but if you do it together, you're going to do it farther, go farther. We see that there are a lot of initiatives everywhere. We have to be able to copy things, but not also everything. We have to look at it in a collective way. Energy transition is a collective endeavor. All stakeholders have to be included. Companies, citizens, public actors. But we also have to find common points with other areas, and so that these solutions can be linked up not only in Europe but in around the world. It's very important to be inspired by other examples of cooperation. We have to foster this. People have to be responsible. They have to look farther into the future and maybe look beyond their own their own limited vision. Public-private structures have to be involved. Cooperation will lead to success. Everything should be open source and transparent because it is publicly financed. We know that it is a trial and error, is done on a trial and error basis. Some areas are not adapted to these type of projects. We love this green cooperation to be able to move forward in our endeavors. This is actually why we're organizing these type of events and why we're publishing this type of reports. We're using different examples from all around the world to be able to move forward and to compare the situations that's happening in various areas and also between the different companies and different organizations. Concerning circular economy, we looked at the Quebec example. For we saw a battery recycling channel. We know that recycled batteries are more expensive than new batteries. How can I put together an economic model based upon recycling, which is low carbon and that is in line with the energy transition? How can I make it profitable and sustainable? Yes, we've spoken about this, the local dynamics. It's very important to move forward. Waste management is costly, and if you do it better, it's even more costly. Collection, triage. We know that it's much more expensive than just throwing everything away in the dump. So our business model for management, for waste managers, it really centers on value. But however, the resale price, it does not allow us to achieve scale in our business model. Normally, it doesn't compensate the surcharge of triage and also collection. So best practices now. Those who have really gone from one mid-range performance to high scale of performance, it's about the resale value. We see that this is often done by asking for more environmental tax from the inhabitants and also to the government. So it's maybe deemed contradictory, if you like. So we see that some territories are able to put in place good practices, and sometimes in some countries and not others. These best practices are feasible only if there is a regional or national framework around them that allows them to actually fund this. We spoke about the REP system, which has put the responsibility on the user concerning the waste costs related to, for example, packaging or various household items. And then therefore they contribute to managing their waste. It's a very virtuous cycle. We looked at the city of Palm, and they moved from 35% to 80% recycling. And so they were able to increase scale, increase scope. However, the price to the inhabitant was compensated because they received funding from the REP. So this is a compensation system. Another system which could mitigate these counterintuitive methods. Another thing is to put a surcharge on incineration. And at the same time, you try to foster collection and also triage of recyclable goods. So surtaxing incineration, encouraging recycling and proper collection. We have seen that it's not only up to the personal initiative of the inhabitants to move forward. It has to be practical, and they have to be recycling has to be fostered in the community, and you have to compensate the households that are actually working with it. There are areas that are very motivated, that are fostering this. However, if it costs too much for the inhabitant, they won't cooperate. We also looked at the MENA region in a West project, water environmental support. We looked at waste management, water waste management in these companies in North Africa and the Middle Eastern regions. So we saw a lot of good best practices, very interesting, which are often underpinned by NGO or civil society. But we didn't find a lot of large-scale projects. They're very low-scale examples. We also have difficulty finding inter-country positive acts. There's also the economic question that has to be looked at. These projects are based upon the resale of recuperated or collected goods, but this is not part of really what we're looking at. We also know that in these countries or in these areas, there's not a local authority budget. Another thing that we have to look at is how can we go over and above these low-scale examples if we do not move towards a real large-scale, for example, composting project, to make sure that these experiments or projects are sustainable. So we have to look at the quality. We have to look also at the legislative framework. And I think that this cannot be done if we don't do it at a European level so that we can put in place these REPs or taxes that I've already spoken about. So this analysis, especially in the building area, we saw that that Holland put in place a legislative framework which was extremely ambitious. And we see that the European Union is dragging its feet in this area. So how can the member states really base upon their movement and among these other examples, and how can they move forward, and how can they use the examples from other countries to make sure that the climate future is well looked after?
So thank you, Antoine, for the question. I will keep it short. I think what we see in our work is that that these local authorities are the key drivers in decarbonization of the building sector, because if you make a national strategy, in the end, it's often local authorities that are the ones that actually have to implement it. They have to talk to the construction companies, they have to talk to the building owners, and they're also the ones that face the complexity of ownership structures, how to finance this, etc. We are convinced that there are many different tools. This is what we as BPIE are working for to do it, but two tools in particular are very important. So one are long-term renovation strategies. So this is also part of what I presented in my previous presentation. So it's important for local authorities to start planning, because if you don't have the data and if you don't know where to start, it's very difficult. And we have reached a point now where it's essential to start making steps. So this is why the Dutch district approach is interesting, because it also shows that once you start analyzing what types of buildings do we have, what types of owners, what types of financing is available, that you start finding issues as well that you have to tackle additionally. So this is why we think that these local strategies are very important to start and to guide action. And one of the projects that we have done this as well in other parts of Europe, so in Eastern Europe, Romania and Bulgaria, we did our building project, where we worked together with 5 municipalities in Bulgaria and Romania, and where we supported them in actually developing their own local renovation strategies and also specific strategies to renovate public buildings, to give an example, and to kickstart renovation activities in the economy and to build scale. So we see also that in the projects where we work, that this is relevant. And now with the COVID pandemic, we also see that in the recovery plans, these long-term renovation strategies are mentioned as important tools to get access to funding. So within Europe, this is specifically also underlining the importance of the long-term renovation strategies. Furthermore, we also see that local authorities need support, because all of a sudden they're now faced with a situation in which they have to manage a very complex, very large, very expensive project when it's about renovating all these buildings. And in Europe, we see that there is also technical support available for them on an EU level. but that often this technical support is not reaching the local authorities. And that means that they're standing for it alone while there is support available. In another project that we did or that we are doing, it's called the Build Upon Scratch project. I will share some links in the chat later. We look at, okay, what are the actual support mechanisms available within the EU on a technical perspective, but also to get access to European funding, whether that's recovery funding or other types of funding. And we believe that altogether, if you have long-term innovation strategies and the sufficient technical support, the local actors are also, and local municipalities are empowered to actually drive further decarbonization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rutger. And ma prochaine question.
Next question to Marie-Ange regarding the previous speakers. We have known regarding the issue of forest community management, which you explained, and the implementation on the field. There are also networks like the Partnership for Forests in Congo and Ecosystem Management Office and networks. Such networks exist to bring together communities. How is this working to share best practices? How can this help to scale up and gain efficiency? Thank you for your question. Very relevant question indeed regarding the Partnership for Congo Basin Forests. It's more of a forum, really. It's a forum for exchanging, discussing solutions, innovations for the preservation of forests. We are having around the table various stakeholders to try to promote a multi-actors governance in the sub-region, but also at the national level. As you said, this is a partnership which also includes indigenous communities and populations. The good thing is that it helps all these populations, communities who don't necessarily have their voice heard at the national level, who do not have the legitimacy or the possibility or the resources to actually talk to the decision makers, to actually find there a platform for inspiration, to have their preoccupation met and for their preoccupation to be at the forefront and to discuss in a more serene way. In Central Africa, because of the stereotypes and cultural issues, unfortunately, indigenous populations are often marginalized and they're not able to be part of the decision-making process. So places like this forum is a place where they can have capacity building, to be connecting to other networks, other stakeholders who may have different points of view, different opinions, sometimes opposed opinions, but to be able to sit together around the same table and to also have the indigenous people who believe that forests are part of their habitat. This is sacred land. It's not always easy to do that, but it's a way to neutralize and to offer them this kind of a space. Now, how does this achieve a larger scale project? It's while all of these stakeholders who may be coming from the same region, but some of them from different countries, we may have different views, but to be able to still have the possibility to share best practices in a framework which is proper for discussions, exchanges at the national level. We know that sometimes challenges or stakes can actually be a source of division and can actually be for personal interests, not necessarily in favor of the majority of the population, and in particular of the indigenous populations. And at the end of the day, they have a lot more power. We are now reaching the end of our workshop. I would like to give Mohammed one last word to talk about COP27. COP27 is going to be taking place in Egypt next year. As your network, you are playing an active role. I imagine that you are preparing yourself for this, and I want to thank also our interpreter. They will have to go in a minute. But Mohammed, as a conclusion, what hope for territorial action for our local stakeholders in view of COP27? Thank you very much. Antoine, during COP26, we had close contacts with the Egyptian delegation. The COP27, as you said, will be taking place in Egypt. 3 main topics. First, how to make progress regarding the inclusions of local authorities, how to include the multi-level governance, how can this be acted in a clear way? As you know, there will be a revision of the NDCs, a review of the NDCs during the COP27. This is very important. Second thing is the speeding up or acceleration of resilience. Egyptians are very keen on that. We are discussing with them to see how can resilience be more of a reality at the local level. They ask us to mobilize more local municipalities, local governments, in order to implement a project for demonstrating this at the COP27. The third point that they raised with us regarding COP26, it was about organizing a large forum, which unfortunately did not happen. So they've asked us to actually organize a large forum with all the local governments in Africa to have a very clear manifestation that would be a key feature of COP27. Resilience, 3 points: resilience, a strong presence of local territories and local governments during COP27. These are the 3 points. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all of our speakers. We thank you all for joining us. We hope you had a good overview of what is in this sector-based report and what local authorities have been able to do for climate. This is a way to show which projects have already been carried out and which have been fulfilled. We will meet again tomorrow for another program, and we will also talk about various study cases. I believe Marie-Ange will be with us tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and we wish you all a nice afternoon and a nice weekend. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.